Yeah, I know. The title sounds absolutely insane. We are now making the claim that all of the Egyptian hieroglyphs that we see right now, carved into all of those buildings, sepulchres, tombs, whatever, all of those hieroglyphs were all carved between the 1100s AD and all the way up to the late 1300s AD. Yeah, that's one hell of a claim, right? Like, I get it. I know you're freaking out right now. You're about to shut this off because you think this is garbage. And I get it. I understand this channel does suck. But I promise this claim is not some sort of a schizo fever dream I had last night. And I just had to come onto YouTube and start telling everybody about it. That's not what this is about. That's not what happened. It's the exact opposite, actually. So, first of all, I am not making the claim. What I want to do is I want to share with all of you some of the stuff that I've been learning and discovering about what other people have been working on for decades, if not, over a couple of centuries at least. And the stuff I want to share with you guys is all based on science. I can't stress that point enough. Everything that we are about to discuss in this show, this is 100% based on science, using the scientific method, using, physics, calculations, etc. This is all just real hard science. There's no weirdness in it. I'm not going all schizo off of my meds or something or whatever. I'm not being taken over by demons or aliens or none of that's happening like right now. That sometimes happens like at other parts, but it's not happening right now. All right. Okay. Anyway, so when we go and we start to look at ancient Egypt, one of the things that we immediately find is that, mainstream has placed ancient Egypt way back in the BC era. So basically, mainstream Egyptology essentially throws ancient Egyptian history back to like the 2200s to 2500s BCE. That's where they essentially throw it. And there's a little bit before all of that stuff. But when you start dealing with stuff like the Old, New, and Middle Kingdom, that's kind of the general timeline. And so ancient Egypt goes for a while there and then slowly peters out kind of in the early BC area, right? I'm going to say early. I'm not going to give the exact date because we don't know it, so I can't give it to you anyway. But anyway, that's what the mainstream has ancient Egypt locked into. So when you go and start learning all of this stuff, everything that you see about ancient Egypt is considered, legitimately ancient. And I mean everything. So whether it's the buildings or the hieroglyphics or whatever, everything took place several thousand years ago. So that's the mainstream perspective, basically, whenever you start to learn about Egyptology from those guys. If you go to a university, you are going to get, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom garbage, and you're going to get all that slop where they talk about, all the pharaohs living, but everybody lived thousands of years ago. What this does when we start to place things thousands upon thousands of years ago is that we actually develop a psychological disconnect from the people that would have lived during that period of time. Even if it's your ancestors, the reality is you probably have not been crying over your great grandfather dying, right? I mean, nobody does that. It's not because you're a heartless, evil person. It's because they're just disconnected from you. Essentially, psychologically, what has happened is that we are disassociating ourselves from that period of time. And once a disassociation is created psychologically, it becomes more difficult for a human to really begin to grasp a potential truth. Now, I only say all of this psychological crazy stuff because it's true. I mean, it's scientifically true, but I actually firmly believe that having a decent understanding of true human psychology and what can be done with it and how it can be manipulated is actually key to you trying to actually understand history. And I know I used actually twice. What do you want from me? Okay, I'm dumb. But anyways, in my opinion, I don't even think it's an opinion. I believe it's a scientific fact that you have to acknowledge the psychological part of understanding history. And there's a few reasons for that, and I won't belabor the point. But anyway, okay, I'm not going to talk about that. My main point is that right now, if you think about it, whenever we go and we look back at something like ancient Egypt, like I said, nobody's crying for it, right? Nobody, even if you're a direct descendant from it, somehow you prove that. I don't know how, but somehow even if you have that lineage, you're not crying for your ancient ancestors like that. And that's because they just don't matter in this day and age. What happens when something doesn't matter to a human is that information can now be easily altered, tweaked, erased, etc., and it can be presented in a false light. This is essentially what has happened with respect to the history of ancient Egypt. It's actually what's happened to essentially all of our histories, but I know I'm not going to go crazy. We are just going to focus on ancient Egypt. But this is a reality that we have to face. We actually live in a time now to where Egyptology has been around for a couple of centuries. I know you can argue maybe a touch longer. Yeah, okay, maybe. Anyway, we'll just say a couple of centuries. I think that's fair enough. Either way, even if it was 300 years ago, doesn't matter. It makes it even worse, actually, because the position that you and I find ourselves in nowadays is this. We've had 200 to 300 years of Egyptologists attempting to try and figure out what was going on with the history of Egypt. And these people, as far as they were concerned, they were actually figuring everything out. So by that I mean, there's a point to where, Flinders Petrie starts writing out the dynasties and everything. He starts basically creating the backbone and the structure for what would eventually become, mainstream chronology for ancient Egypt. Now, at first, when he was doing all of that, everybody was not over there, sucking him off, right? Everybody wasn't like, yeah, you're right, dude. You've got it all figured out, buddy. Yeah, thank goodness you showed up because we never would have figured it out. That's not what was happening back then. Like back then, when he was starting to do this stuff, people, they were not all in agreement. And you find this all over the historical narrative, by the way. Whenever you see some sort of a history start to be figured out, you will always find detractors. However, in mainstream history, you never or very rarely ever hear about the detractors. You very rarely ever hear the alternative opinions of other scholars. Because once an idea has taken over, once an idea is starts to dominate, and once an idea can be exploited by higher powers, that idea will suddenly start to become the mainstream narrative. And that's what we face right now with Egypt. All right, so all of that just to say, we actually do have a true problem when it comes to the chronology of ancient Egypt. We scientifically do not know anything about the chronology of ancient Egypt. We don't know anything. I mean, we have no evidence that points to specific dates for things happening with respect to ancient Egypt. We just don't have anything. But the way Egyptologists talk, you would think that they have everything. You would think that they found this grand library or multiple libraries all written out in whatever language you read, and it's all right there for you. You just crack open a book, you can just start reading down the list, and it lists everything perfectly. And then, this is basically the way mainstream Egyptologists treat the chronology of Egypt. And the most ridiculous part of the whole thing is that it's insane. Because, like I said, we do not have any scientific evidence to prove any of the mainstream Egyptology chronology. And this is a fact. This is a fact that we can't run away from. People write, I understand, I get it if you're thinking, oh, this is crazy, schizo stuff. Of course they know. Prove it. This is what I would say. I would challenge an Egyptologist. I'm not telling you to prove it. I'm not getting on you. I'm just saying, whenever, if you ever have the opportunity, to meet and talk to a real Egyptologist, ask them to show you the scientific proof. And when I talk about scientific proof, I'm not just saying that term just to throw it out there and whatever. No, I mean, I want the real science to prove the date that somebody is making a claim for when it comes to something in ancient Egypt. So for example, if you're going to tell me that Ramses III, lived during 1155 BC or whatever, he was around then. That's a mainstream date. But if a mainstream Egyptologist is going to make this claim about a particular pharaoh living during this time, that's 3,000 years ago relative to us, show me the proof. I mean, I want to see the real scientific evidence that substantiates the claim. And here's the problem: mainstream Egyptologists have nothing. Now, a lot of people don't realize this. I think most people honestly believe that Egyptologists are coming from a place of supreme knowledge. Like I said, I think most people honestly believe that they translated all the hieroglyphs, and all the hieroglyphs gave the entire history of 3,000 years worth of Egyptian history, or 2,500 years of ancient Egyptian history. It doesn't matter. Either way, your average person, I think, probably honestly believes that all of this has been perfectly mapped out, and so when they see it in a textbook, they have no reason to question it. So here's where the dissociative problem comes into play, or the psychological issue of dissociation. We all ended up suffering this problem. If you are alive right now, you have suffered a dissociative psychological attack. Yeah, I know, you might think like, no, there's no way, bro. I could never be attacked psychologically. I'm too smart. No. No. If you are a human, you have been affected by psychological warfare. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's literally that. Now, I'm not going to get all schizo, but I point it out because what has happened with all of us, we are all guilty of this, is that as we grew up in our societies, our Western society, right? I'm not talking about other cultures. I'm talking about a Western-centric ideology. What has happened is that anybody who teaches anything about ancient Egyptology, the vast majority, and I mean like 99% of people, they are just teaching what those who came before them have supposedly learned. So in the mainstream, for example, in the academic institution situation, all of those teachers have no reason to doubt any of the people that came before them who laid out this entire history, right? The chronology that is taught right now in the mainstream, nobody questions it, right? Nobody operating on a mainstream academic level is challenging any of these dates, or at the very least, they aren't challenging the dates to the point to where things have to be entirely rewritten. You might find, little bits here and there to where maybe some pharaoh has to be moved like 2 years forward or 2.5 months back or whatever. Very little changes that technically don't really change anything in the broad scope of chronology. Where the dissociative property comes into play is that we now find people who are teaching Egyptology, they have no problem teaching what they are teaching for two reasons. One, they have been psychologically conditioned to believe the authoritative power that has bestowed upon them the ability to teach, because in their mind, they really think, well, if anything was wrong here, somebody else in the past would have caught it. Some other teacher, some other Egyptologist, somebody else would have called out the error back in the day, and the error would have been changed. So right now, educators honestly believe that they are standing on extraordinarily strong ground, because they honestly believe that people that came before them, they didn't make any mistakes, or if they did make mistakes, other people already caught it. And of course, they also believe that there are no malicious actors in the academic arena that would want to alter chronology for some other weird reason. The academics, they legitimately believe that nobody would commit forgeries, and certainly none of the forgeries would ever make it into the real history books. Yeah, academics honestly believe that. It's absolutely insane. They're crazy. All right, so you have that whole problem right there, which is more than enough to already screw up the way everybody looks at Egyptology and chronology. But then we have the other factor, which is the disassociative factor. Now, the disassociative factor is kind of like the final nail in the coffin. So by that I mean these people ultimately, basically all of us, I mean we're all guilty of this, because we have no true connection really to anyone back in that time period. 2500 BC. That's a long time ago. Because none of us have a true, real connection to those periods anymore, we have no true, real reason to fight for the truth. Because the reality is, all of this stuff was a long time ago, and ultimately, it's just too far away to really matter in today's day and age. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons that a lot of people really don't get into history all that much, is because, it's just so far back. I mean, it just does not matter in your average person's day-to-day life. And they have no reason to believe that it does. So what happens is a disassociation is created in the mind that gets you away from potentially understanding something that may actually matter to you. And then even worse, of course, the reality is there are power structures on this planet that have been and are currently exploiting the disassociative state that a human can fall into. All right, and that's just the reality. This is what we face when we study history. A lot of people don't think of it like that. A lot of people think that, history is all happiness and gumdrops and everybody's holding hands, singing Kumbaya and tickling each other's butts. None of that's really true. I mean, the reality is we have some pretty malicious institutions right now that are going out of their way to absolutely control the historical narrative. And they'll do anything they can to control that narrative, and that means changing history, erasing history, basically just obtaining total control. Now, this is where we run into our problem when it comes to the hieroglyphics. Quick question. When you think about ancient Egypt, what do you think about? Pyramids, Osirion, hieroglyphics, the Sphinx, etc. Very, very Egyptian style of art, I guess we could say. And you all know what I'm talking about. For example, if I show you a picture of the Sphinx, and then the next picture I show you is of typical Egyptian hieroglyphics, not a single bell or whistle will go off in your head saying, hey, wait a second, those two things do not belong together. Like, that doesn't happen with the vast majority of people. Now, why is that? Well, because apparently we already know everything there is to know about ancient Egypt, and the reason why we know that is because these great Egyptologists have already pieced together the entire basic history, and they, of course, have published many papers that specifically state that all of these buildings, all of these hieroglyphics, all of this art, all came from the ancient Egyptians during the time between 2500 BC and the early BC era. This message is essentially what has been drilled into everybody in the West's head. So when we see hieroglyphics, we immediately associate hieroglyphics with ancient Egypt. This is another psychological trick that can be exploited and has been exploited, but I won't get into that crap anymore. We're not here to listen to that. We'll talk about that later at some other point in time. But this is what's going on. Basically, the entire Western world has been psychologically trained to associate hieroglyphics with structures such as the pyramid and the Sphinx. Here's my question to you, and it is a scientific question through and through. Is it possible that the hieroglyphics that we see today that are covering, all kinds of temples and monuments and tombs, etc., is it possible that those hieroglyphics were created at a much later date than the structures that they cover right now? Is it possible that what we are seeing in what we right now consider ancient Egypt, is it possible that we are seeing two or more different civilizations that lived in completely different eras in the Delta Nile? So by that I mean, is it possible that the pyramids were built by one culture and the hieroglyphics were designed and carved by a completely different culture later on down the chronological line? Is this a possibility? The scientific answer is yes, it is a possibility. And remember, this is all based on science. We are not here to speculate on garbage. We are not factoring in weird things like God or UFOs or aliens or reptilians. We literally do not need anything schizo like that. We can scientifically ask the question, are we looking at multiple different cultures when we look back at what we consider right now as ancient Egypt? So what we are going to cover in this show is that we are going to look at the scientific evidence that other scholars and scientists have discovered in relation to ancient Egypt that has the potential to change everything. And I mean completely rewrite history, completely make you rethink everything you thought you knew about all history. Obviously, we're only focusing on ancient Egypt, but the potential of what this changes is literally everything. Because don't forget, Egyptian chronology is one of the backbone chronologies for all chronologies on this planet. So if ancient Egyptian chronology is wrong at all, and I mean at all, if something's off by 100 years only, that means everything has to change. What we are going to find in this show today is that things are absolutely screwed up. I mean, the mainstream has absolutely lost its mind. What's even more interesting about these discoveries is its relation to catastrophism. Now, hopefully, as everybody should know now, if you're watching this garbage channel, is that on this channel, we only focus on scientific methodology with respect to ancient history. By applying the scientific method to all of the mythologies and the legends and all of this other stuff that we have now learned about history, what happens is that a completely different picture about ancient history starts to surface. And this picture is now backed up by science. So that means we are starting to substantiate reality with respect to all of that crazy stuff that our ancestors were talking about. So this is where catastrophism comes into play. Remember, all of our ancestors have tons of stories about the gods, fighting up in the sky and destroying Earth multiple times over. History is absolutely full of that stuff. And what we've been doing now using science is that we have been proving that perhaps a lot of the stuff that our ancestors have been talking about or that recorded may have actually happened. And of course, if these stories end up being true, then that means there are some pretty serious ramifications that we have to take into account relative to chronology. So, for example, a lot of our ancestors make the claim that Earth had a really close encounter with the planet Venus. In fact, it had multiple close encounters with the planet Venus around the 1500s-ish BC timeframe. This encounter did a lot of damage, not only to planet Earth, but it absolutely wiped out entire civilizations on this planet. Now, all of our ancestors generally recorded some kind of event like this during this particular period of time. The problem, however, comes into play when we look at the mainstream chronology. So if we have Venus interacting with Earth during the 1500s BC, that means the entire chronology has to be completely different if this is the case, because obviously mainstream chronology is not factoring in any of these cosmological events that all of our ancestors talk about. So if we are going to factor in these events and we're going to take them seriously, that means the chronology is going to have to necessarily change from what the mainstream currently has it as. Now, the good news is that we now know for a scientific fact that mainstream chronology is just outright wrong. It's a blatant lie at this point in time. So the good news about this position is that once we realize that mainstream chronology is just outright wrong, and we have that now, that means we can open up the door to an entirely new scientific interpretation of what actually happened in the past. What that means is that all of those catastrophic events that our ancestors talk about everywhere, and remember, this is all over the entire planet. I mean, this is not just one or two little areas that talk about these earth-destroying cataclysms. It's everywhere. Everybody has these stories. So if we take those stories seriously and we follow the science, we necessarily then have to make the conclusion that mainstream chronology has to be wrong. Now, maybe some of you have noticed, discarding mainstream chronology is not going to be an easy task, even if you're on the alternative side of the research. What's funny about alternative people is that they even still believe in the mainstream chronology. And the reason for that is simple. They've never been taught generally that there could be a completely different chronology in the background. They've bought into the lies just like anybody in the mainstream. And the reason is simple. We've all been conditioned our entire lives to believe that this particular chronology is correct. But now we have proof that that entire situation is false, which means that we can now approach history in a completely different light. So for those people who are skeptical about catastrophism or who have just outright wrote it off, things suddenly change because the science is now allowing us to apply all of those stories, all of those mythologies and legends, or ultimately they're just histories that all of our ancestors recorded. The new chronology allows us to place them in where they belong. Now, there's a problem with doing that, though, because if we're going to change the chronology a few thousand years, that is going to have ramifications that are going to reverberate down the chronological line, which means that we now have to pay attention to not only ancient chronologies, we now have to pay attention to chronologies that are closer to us in time. And by that, I mean we may actually have to change the chronology of just 600 years ago, even 500 to 400 to 300 years ago. All of the dates that right now we believe we have locked into place just a few hundred years ago, those dates may actually have to change, and a lot of events that we ascribe to certain time periods of that recent time period may have to either be completely changed or thrown into the garbage as false. Yeah, I know, I'm rambling, but you get my point, right? Regardless of whether you deal with the current mainstream chronology or a brand new chronology, if you make a change in the ancient past, that is going to necessarily cause problems for basically everything else that relies on that particular change. Which means that there are going to be a lot of events that took place in ancient history or even recent history that would necessarily be different if catastrophism is real. Now, these Egyptian zodiacs actually go a huge distance towards proving that exact concept. So, in chronology, we have a problem with Egypt. The reality is, we have no idea truly on a scientific level when ancient Egypt existed, who truly were all the kings and queens and whatever, and when they ruled. We truly have no clear picture of any of that. Remember, mainstream Egyptian chronology is based on literal forgeries, a completely misunderstood, quote, king's list, and just bad interpretations of evidence in a non-scientific way. That is literally everything that the chronology of ancient Egypt is built on. And this is stupid because Egyptologists themselves have literally discovered a scientific universal dating system that can tell Egyptologists an exact date about when something is being recorded. And that system is called the Zodiac system. What makes this even funnier is that Egyptologists have literally found hundreds, if not thousands, of these zodiacs carved into all kinds of ruins, tombs, etc. I mean, they're right there. The Egyptologists can see them, and make no mistake, Egyptologists themselves acknowledge that these are indeed zodiacs. Now, for those of you who don't know what a zodiac is, let me give a quick rundown. Basically, a zodiac is a recording of the position of all the planetary bodies that a civilization is aware of and their relation to the various constellations in the sky. Now, anybody who's, studied any kind of cosmology, you know what this means. You can essentially roll back the clock and you can find out when the planetary bodies were in the recorded positions, and then you can spit out a date. So right there, that is a huge deal, isn't it? If we have ancient Egyptian inscriptions that are made out in the form of a zodiac, that means the ancient Egyptians may be telling us about certain dates, right? That's what the science points to. And make no mistake, the first Egyptologists that started to find these zodiacs, they knew exactly what they were finding. The people who found this back in the 1800s, etc., they were not confused by what they were seeing. The ancient Egyptologists, they knew exactly what they were looking at. They knew, after a short second of, figuring stuff out, they realized that they were indeed looking at zodiacs. All right, so they knew it, a couple 100 years ago, 300 years ago. This is not a new problem. So if these Egyptologists were discovering zodiacs, why the hell are we not talking about zodiacs all the time when it comes to ancient Egyptian history? By the way, nobody is arguing that these are not zodiacs. There's no Egyptologist that you were going to run into that will say, no, those are not horoscopes, those aren't zodiacs. They won't say that. They are well aware of what these carvings are. This is not a mystery to Egyptologists. This is not something that they have never run into before, right? We are not presenting any kind of new evidence right now that's going to shift the paradigm for Egyptology. That's not what happened. What happened was when these hieroglyphs were being discovered by the earliest Egyptologists, like Flinders Petrie and Napoleon's army, etc., when people were digging around back there and found the zodiacs, once they realized what they found, there were good physicists back then that tried to do the calculations to get dates to see, hey, look, when the hell were these things carved? What were the ancient Egyptians talking about? Here's a zodiac. This is awesome. That means we can get an exact date. So what these guys did is they started calculating the zodiacs that they were finding down there a few hundred years ago, and the answers that they were getting from all of the zodiacs, and I mean every single zodiac, were 100% not in line with mainstream historical chronology. Basically, they completely disagreed with the Scaligerrian chronology, which, was being taught by this point in time to everybody. So once all of these Egyptologists and physicists started getting wrong numbers, right? Because at that point, everybody already basically knew, a general idea of when ancient Egypt existed. Because by this time, Champollion, the guy who basically decoded the Rosetta Stone, he had already arbitrarily thrown ancient Egypt back into the, 2000 plus BC era. And everybody was fine with this. There are plenty of people who questioned it, but, they were pushed aside, and eventually this date is what started mainstream Egyptology, and then everybody kind of started to build it on from there. So when everybody was doing the calculations for the zodiacs, they weren't finding dates in the 2000 BC era. They weren't finding dates in the 1000 BC era. They weren't even finding dates in the first millennium AD era. All of the Egyptian zodiac dates all spoke to one very particular time frame. And that time frame is between 1000 AD and 1400 AD. That's right. Remember, science doesn't care about our feelings. It doesn't matter what we feel. It doesn't matter what we want. At the end of the day, the quote ancient Egyptians were suddenly not so ancient anymore. So basically, all these people that were doing these calculations, they were making a discovery that went completely against established chronology. So now if you're wondering, why have you never heard about any of this? The answer is simple. Egyptologists are very much married to the mainstream chronology. Any evidence that proves that mainstream chronology incorrect has to be discarded by an Egyptologist. They have no choice. So that's why there's not huge specials all the time on Discovery or whatever mainstream crap still exists today, to where they are going in depth and looking at all of these horoscopes and trying to figure out why the dates are not lining up with mainstream chronology. Right? They're not doing any of that. They have no interest in doing that because they've already got their degree, right? They already have their position of power. They are not about to relinquish that, and they are certainly not going to admit that they are wrong. It's unfortunate, but it's the truth. You know, it's just basic human emotions that are essentially keeping everybody back from knowing the truth. How sad is that we live in a society to where people's greed and power, you know, usurps real science? And that's the world we live in. I mean, that's just the reality. Everywhere you look, you're told to trust the science unless the science goes against the mainstream narrative. You know, that's literally where we're at right now. It's insane. Okay. Anyway, back to the Zodiacs. So, Zodiacs are discovered, you know, very early on in what we consider Egyptology. And don't forget, Egyptology is still very much a recent institution. You know, it really only began in the 1700s, if I'm extremely generous with that date. But the reality is, most people probably place the beginning of Egyptology in the 1800s AD, obviously, not BC. The Egyptians were not studying themselves back in the day. Okay, anyway. Isn't it interesting, though, that Egyptology really has not been around that long, which means that, you know, ancient Egypt, or all of those ruins and everything, were essentially sitting there with people not really caring about them for hundreds, if not, you know, 1,000+ years. It's a very interesting situation down there. I think a lot of people take that for granted, because don't forget, you know, the Egyptians that lived around those monuments during the, you know, 1600s-ish on up, you know, they didn't know where they came from either. Right? None of those people that lived there had any of the stories. It's hilarious to think about it, but even the, quote, locals back in the day, they had no idea what any of those ruins were, because they didn't build them. Their ancestors didn't build them. The whole concept of the Egyptians now taking credit for what was done thousands of years ago, this is a wholly new phenomenon. It's the same thing that we see in, like, South America, for example, or North America. Actually, it's the same thing we find all over the planet. When Europeans run into locals in a certain area and they find all of these ruins, one of the things that the locals that they talk to, the locals always tell the European explorers, we did not build this stuff. When we got here, these buildings were already ancient. Right? And that's what they tell everybody. And this is a common thing all throughout history. Very fascinating. Anyway, I only say this to make a point that, you know, the people that lived around the Egyptian area during the beginning of Egyptology, they weren't all that much help because they had no information with respect to that area either. So what that means is that whoever did either the building of the monuments or the carving of all of the hieroglyphs, we don't know who the hell these people were. There is potentially an exception, but these people were summarily ignored as well by Egyptologists when Egyptology started, and that would be the Kemetologists, or the people who call the land of Egypt Kem. Right? I don't know for a fact if those people were hanging around Egypt back in the 1700s. I don't really have any proof of that. But Kemetology would at the very least eventually arise, and those people seem to think that they have a good grasp on maybe what would have happened in the past. And I'm kind of right there with them. The whole Kemetology thing is very interesting because the history of Kemet, or Kem, you know, that actually weaves itself up north and gets, I don't know, the whole thing gets weird with that. But we're not going to talk about that, even though it's completely relevant. Technically, we're only going to focus on Zodiacs. But I did want to give credit where credit is due to other kinds of researchers back in the day who may have been on to the truth before any of the stuff that we're talking about now was coming to light. Now, I don't know if the Kemetologists had anything to say about the Zodiacs back in the day, but at the very least, I wanted to mention those guys because they, at the very least, seem to be trying to find the truth. And I think some of those guys actually believe they are descendants from Kem. Anyway, that's a completely different subject anyways. I just wanted everybody to know that I am trying to look at multiple angles here to try to get the information. But either way, it kind of doesn't matter because at the end of the day, the zodiacs that were left to us from whoever the hell the ancient Egyptians were, they actually do give us dates. All right, let's get into the dating system. Now, the dating system I am going to present to all of you guys was discovered by Nozovsky and Fomenko. These two guys did a lot of good work on all of these zodiacs and horoscopes, but they are not the only ones. And in fact, right now, basically anybody could right now go and prove this themselves with some of the computer software that exists now. And obviously, we all have access to a lot of the zodiacs through just the internet. You can just go find pictures of the zodiacs and you can do your own calculations. And that's kind of the beauty of this whole situation, is that you at home right now, you can test this theory like we should be, right? If somebody comes forward with a scientific claim, and the claim here is that the zodiacs that are recorded in ancient Egypt are indeed not showing dates from an ancient time, but are showing dates that range from 1000 AD to 1400 AD. If somebody is going to make this claim, and it's a scientific claim, we should be testing it, and of course that is what has happened. What's even more interesting, though, is that the original Egyptologists that started doing these calculations, they found out the exact same results back in the day as well. So I find that information valuable too, because that means that Egyptologists, even a couple hundred years ago, already knew this information. And what did they do with it? They threw it away. And they threw it away because it did not agree with the Scaligerine chronology. Now, we don't care about the Scaligerine chronology here because we know for a fact, for a scientific fact, that chronology is bogus. So when we start to calculate these zodiacs and we start to get completely different dates, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. And that's exactly what Nozovsky and Fomenko did. Now, we find zodiacs all over the place over there in Egypt. In fact, they're pretty damn hard to ignore because, like I said, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of them written in all kinds of places. So if you're wondering what the excuse is that the mainstream uses to get away from the problem of the zodiacs, this is what they do. So when you present them with a zodiac, an Egyptologist will immediately tell you that, no, that zodiac does not convey any real information. Those zodiacs are all symbolic. They don't actually convey anything. This is literally what Egyptologists will tell you if you bring up the zodiac problem. Here's the issue with that, though. Like I said, you can actually calculate what's in these zodiacs. Right? This is not like some sort of a fantasy or a fiction. Your average Egyptologist has no clue how to calculate zodiacs, right? And it's not easy, so I'm not like dogging on them or anything. There's a lot of physics calculations that you have to go through. But nowadays we have computers, so anybody can do this stuff. So it's very funny that Egyptologists, they still hold on to that excuse that all zodiacs are just symbolic and contain no information. I know, I've been blabbing this whole time about all kinds of garbage, but I haven't given you guys any actual real dates that any of these zodiacs calculated. So let me do that. Let me give you guys a quick little list of all the different dates that have been calculated off of some of these zodiacs so you guys can get an idea of the range that is actually coming out of these zodiacs. Now, the good thing about zodiacs is that we can get really, really precise when it comes to the dating. So these dates that I'm about to read off to you, they are not averages, they are not, sort of guesses. They are legitimately precise dates that the zodiacs themselves talk about or record. All right, so we have April 22nd, 1168 AD. March 20th, 1185 AD. August 14th, 969 AD. August 5th, 1206 AD. March 31st, 1394 AD. Yeah, you get it? Everything is in AD, so I'll stop saying AD. April 5th, 1146. April 16th, 1325, and September 5th, 1162. So that's just a quick little, sampling of the dates that are out there, but you can go and test these dates as well. So anyway, back to the mainstream's perspective on the Zodiacs. Remember, these guys essentially just think that all of these Zodiacs are just symbolic, right? They're just made up garbage. Now, we know that's not true simply because we can calculate everything. But one of the basic ways that we know that that is not true is that when you look at one of these Egyptian zodiacs, what you find is that you immediately see that you find the planets are all always in places that they should be. So what I mean by that is that you never find Mercury like represented anywhere that it would never actually be. So, you know, Mercury, Venus, all of these planets are represented in the zodiac itself, and they're not in the middle of other planets, right? So Mercury never appears between Saturn and Mars, for example, right? Because it doesn't do that in real life, so why the hell would it be represented there? So if the excuse of all of these zodiacs being symbolic were real, we would expect to probably just find, you know, planets being thrown everywhere within the zodiac. Right? We should not find zodiacs that are all cosmologically correct. And that's the weird thing. All of these zodiacs, they are all represented cosmologically in a correct configuration. Now, Egyptologists have no way around this, and at this point in time, they will either stop talking to you, or they will simply call you a conspiracy theorist and start running away. It's on you if you want to go chase them down and start slapping them. That's your choice. Right, but Egyptologists will necessarily start to avoid this subject because that's a glaring scientific fact that they can't deal with when you come to these zodiacs, is the fact that the planetary configurations are always correct. Now, the planetary configurations being the way they are now in these zodiacs is important. It's really important, not just because it makes the zodiac real, obviously that matters, but if we are going to factor in catastrophism into a new chronology, planetary locations are going to be extraordinarily important. So what we find with Egyptian hieroglyphics or Egyptian horoscopes, or zodiacs, whatever you want to call them, when we find these zodiacs representing planetary configurations that exist today, that, you know, in the sense of the solar system that we know of today, it looks like the Egyptians who were writing these hieroglyphs also lived during a time when the solar system had finally settled, right? And that's what these hieroglyphics show. So for people in catastrophism, one of the things we can now say for a fact, using science, is that whoever did these hieroglyphics, whoever created these zodiacs, they lived after a time to where all of these catastrophes had already happened. It was done. These people don't know anything about the Mars event or the Venus event or the flood. These guys don't, or they might know about them, but those events would have been ancient to them as well. Because right now they're representing the solar system in the way that we see it today. So without even actually getting a date at all out of any of these zodiacs, we can already make the assumption that the people who did this, you know, they are much closer to us in history than they are to anything ancient, right? That is immediately what we can draw out of just having this particular planetary configuration, or I should say the solar system's configuration in its current form known to the people who did these zodiacs. So that's an extraordinary piece of evidence for us, because that means that we should now inherently be looking at a time closer to us just from that configuration alone. So then when we go and we start to plug in all of the planetary configurations that we find in these zodiacs, what do we get? We get exactly what we would expect to find. So what Fomenko and Nozovsky started showing is that when they started doing all the calculations for all these zodiacs spread all over hell and back over Egypt, they started finding that the dates were all around one particular era. They were not spread out over tens of thousands of years. They were not invalid. Every single horoscope, every single zodiac that these guys went and calculated, they all spit out a date. Even more interesting is that they all spit out dates very close to each other. And this is exactly what we would expect to find if the Egyptians who wrote these zodiacs were legitimately recording a period of time in their history. And that's what we have. I mean, there it is, right? So when they started recording these zodiacs, we have times of like 1152, 1273, 1029. They start coming up with all of these years, and they all range between 1000 AD and 1400 AD. But at 1400 AD is the latest one that they found. So I know that sounds crazy, right? I get it. So you're saying, wait, so you're saying that the ancient Egyptians that we know and love, they did not exist 3,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago? Are you saying they existed only 1,000 years ago? I'm not suggesting anything. I am following the science. There's nothing else we can do about that, right? What do you want from me? The science shows us that whoever did those hieroglyphs, they were dealing in a time period that is represented in the hieroglyphs, and that's between 1000 AD and 1400 AD. Now, I highly recommend going and looking at some of these books that are out there. There's even presentations out there as well on YouTube you can find. So it's not just me talking out of my butt. This is legitimate science. And you, of course, like I said, go grab a few of the Egyptian zodiacs, go find some of the pictures, go learn how to differentiate between what planet is what, etc. What planet was visible, what planet was not visible, etc., etc. And you can start to plug all of these pieces of information into a program, and then you can rewind the clock and it will tell you when that zodiac existed. And so people have been doing this now for years, obviously, and what people are finding is they are finding that these dates are accurate. It's not just, Fomenko and Nozovsky who are crazy. No, they're legit, and all of their information is being corroborated by outside sources as well. All right, so there's very little we can do to get away from this. But what are the ramifications of this? Right now we're saying, so wait, the ancient Egyptians, they only existed a little bit ago. What does this do for us? Well, it changes everything, right? I mean, 100% changes absolutely everything. Now, we have to deal with these ramifications. If we are finding that whoever wrote these zodiacs down lived only 1,000 years ago, what does that mean for Egyptian history? Does that mean that the pyramids and the Sphinx and all of this stuff was built only 1,000 years ago? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But it also doesn't mean that some of that stuff wasn't built only 1,000 years ago. This is the problem with ancient Egypt. So we're only dating the hieroglyphics and the zodiacs right now. I think it's extraordinarily important to understand that point. I am not making any claim to any of the actual structures about what time frames those were actually built in. Now, it's entirely possible that some of this stuff was indeed built 1,000 years ago. That's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible. But I would argue that the evidence actually shows that the people who carved in all these hieroglyphs, the people who recorded these zodiacs, I would argue that the people who did those things, they adopted an already ruined ancient Egypt. These people probably came and found and discovered, all these ruins sitting there in the now desert, and they took refuge there, right? There was already a lot of stuff there, so why not take it over? So I could definitely see something like that happen, and that would make sense anyways from a catastrophist point of view. Because, right, so for example, we know for a fact that the time frame that the pyramids were built in, they were not built in a desert, right? The Egypt that we know now did not exist when all of these buildings and this civilization was thriving and being built. Like that's not the case. We now know for a fact that the Sahara is only maybe a few thousand years old. Right? And that's a mainstream possibility as well. I'm not just saying on the alternative side of things. There are actually mainstream scientists nowadays who are jumping on the claim that, yeah, man, the Sahara Desert is not that old. That whole area that is now desertified, is that a word? That is now just a huge desert was not like that when the pyramids were being built. Now you'll notice that does not send the pyramids back 10,000 plus years. We run into a lot of problems actually. So okay, check this out. I know I'm all over the place. So we have two sides of the Egypt coin that we have to deal with. We have the mainstream. I've already talked about them enough. You get it. Then we have the alternative research community. Now, the alternative research community has lately been throwing Egypt even further back in time than like 2700 BC. That would be the work being done by Shock and all of those guys over there. So once those kind of discoveries were made, alternative historians jumped on it, and then suddenly, because because of a geological principle of water wear, suddenly all of those ruins were now being sent back further in time. Now here's the interesting thing. Now first of all, to not mischaracterize the alternative position, that's mainly just the Sphinx enclosure that is showing major water wear. So not every single building has all of that water wear, which is intriguing in and of itself, right? So why don't we find water erosion on all the other buildings, and why is it so like centralized to the Sphinx area, to the Sphinx enclosure? I don't have an answer for it. It's just something that's interesting. Anyway, because we don't have solid answers for all of that stuff, we still cannot place real dates on any of that history. So then there's just too many discrepancies, right? So right now we have an entire alternative history side that has no problem throwing the pyramids and the Sphinx and all of that stuff back into 10,000 plus BC, and that's solely based on the water wear and tear on the Sphinx enclosure. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about all of that stuff. I just wanted to point out that just because the hieroglyphics are talking about particular dates that are pretty damn close to us right now, that does not mean that the structures themselves were built during this time. Now, the reason why this is important to catastrophism is this. We have mythological accounts of a giant freshwater lake essentially being where the Sahara now is. So if you're wondering where all that sand came from, one of the theories is that, yeah, there was this lake called Lake Triton, and this is indeed in some mythologies, and this freshwater lake was surrounded by, extraordinarily lush, vegetation, etc. So this would have been a fantastic place to build large structures around, right, back in the day. So there's a good chance that all of, the pyramids, the Sphinx, all the major megalithic style of structures would have been built during the time that Lake Triton existed. Where did Lake Triton go? Well, we think we know. If mythologies are to be believed, it sounds like the Venus event is what would have taken out Lake Triton. So whatever civilizations existed around Lake Triton, and don't forget, a lot of those civilizations are now under the Mediterranean Ocean. Don't forget that, right? We have all those city ruins. All of those cities were probably above water before the Venus event took place. Maybe. That gets a little gray, so I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, the Egyptian civilization that we're focusing on now, the ones that would have built all the structures, once Venus did one of its flybys, and then once one of the catastrophic engagements with Venus took out Lake Triton, essentially anybody that was living in the area now no longer had a source of fantastic fresh water. Right, the jungle, the foliage, whatever existed around this lake suddenly had no more access to the water that used to supply it. So once Lake Triton, basically the dam gets broken and then all that water rushes into the ocean, suddenly you now have an entire area in North Africa which becomes a desert rather quickly because its fresh water source is gone. Whatever lake was there is now gone. So this would have taken out the culture that would have built all of those megalithic structures. One of the interesting things about the megalithic structures that we find is that generally none of those structures seem to naturally have any hieroglyphs carved into them. The Great Pyramid of Giza is a perfect example of this. We find no hieroglyphic carvings inside the Great Pyramid. In fact, we find no hieroglyphic carvings in a lot of the stuff around there, right? And that's the interesting problem. We seem to find hieroglyphic carvings only in areas that people could access from an outside perspective. So whoever found the Egyptian ruins, like in 1000 AD, let's just say, whoever found those ruins, they obviously could not get inside the Great Pyramid. There was all kinds of places they were unable to get inside of. And so because they couldn't get inside, they could not retroactively carve all of those hieroglyphs and zodiacs into the ruins. So any place that we find stuff like zodiacs or hieroglyphs, we only find them in relatively easily accessible places or inside tombs or in structures that could have easily been carved out or built by, a general population. You don't have to be megalithic culture to be able to carve a cave, right? You don't need to have that. So it's interesting that we find hieroglyphics carved only in areas that would have been accessible to a moderate kind of a civilization. These people obviously weren't stupid, but they were not operating on a megalithic scale. So what does this do for us? Well, it does a few things. First of all, it makes sense with the evidence relative to the hieroglyphics and how they relate to the buildings. When we start to look at the hieroglyphics that have been carved into all of these structures, we find that they are not exactly what we would call laser perfect. Some are great, don't get me wrong, but the vast majority of them, they really do just look like they were carved by a moderate civilization. This is in direct contrast to all of the structures that we find in Egypt, all the megalithic structures that we find, because all of those structures are built, well, they're built on a megalithic scale, which is impressive in and of itself. But we also find that these structures are constructed in a manner that is incredible from an engineering perspective. Right? We find some unbelievably accurate cuts all over the place with respect to all of these megalithic structures. So it's weird that the hieroglyphs themselves are not really done to that level of accuracy. What this evidence potentially shows is that we may have at least two completely different cultures that the mainstream chronology has lumped into one culture. And that's the big mistake. What if the hieroglyphics that we find all over Egypt are not done by the same people who built the pyramids, who built all the temples, who built the amazing tombs, etc.? What if there's an actual separation there? This is a legitimate question because we really do have a problem of finding hieroglyphics kind of all over the place, but we only find them in accessible areas. Not only that, the hieroglyphs and the artwork relative to the hieroglyphs, they do not display the level of accuracy that we find with respect to the buildings all over Egypt. So this is a legitimate problem. It's a problem actually that we find all throughout history all over the world. We actually find situations to where we find megalithic structures that were built using incredibly precise engineering. So we have a legitimate problem that is not really thought about, but what this Zodiac evidence does for us is that it potentially gives us a completely different insight into the real chronology of Egypt. What I love about this evidence is that it actually goes a long way in substantiating the catastrophism claims. Because we have a situation now to where if a civilization that was advanced enough to build all those megalithic, buildings and stuff over there in Egypt existed, how do you get rid of them? Well, a catastrophe will definitely get rid of a civilization, especially if it can destroy a lake the size of Lake Triton. So you get rid of that lake, the civilizations that were, that existed around there, they die off, not just because they lost their water, but because they would have had to have dealt with all of the destruction raining down on them. So they go bye-bye. But their structures would have survived, more or less because of how megalithic they were, right? So it's almost like these people knew what was coming, or at least knew that they had to prepare for something like this. Obviously, it probably didn't work out. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened then. But either way, it seems like that original civilization, disappeared. Then we have an entirely different group of people show up, and they take over those ruins and they start using them for their civilization. And it looks like that civilization lasted for a few hundred years before it eventually petered out and then morphed into something else, into eventually what we would find today. Now, what this evidence also does for us is that it helps clean up the catastrophism timeline. One of the things that it definitely changes is that it makes a lot of these catastrophes not quite as far back in history as even the alternative researchers may believe. One of the big problems right now that we have in catastrophism research is that a lot of these people absolutely ignore the problem of chronology. So when anybody talks about, ancient Egypt being destroyed with, whatever your theory is, it doesn't matter. Everybody is still using the mainstream chronology and they are ignoring evidence like this. What this does for catastrophists is that it gives us a good idea of at least a point in history that we can say for a fact that the solar system had finally settled into its current configuration. Now, this does not mean that the solar system settled into its current configuration at exactly, 1000 AD. That's not what that means. It just means that by 1000 AD, at the earliest, we can say for a fact the solar system was in its current configuration. Yeah, I know. We've gone on long enough. So the zodiac information is there. It's a legitimate scientific data point, and it cannot be ignored when we start to build up a historical picture. Especially if you are a catastrophist, or that, you are at least following the evidence and you have to deal with catastrophes. This is really important, because now we can use this evidence to zero in on when the solar system finally settled into its current configuration. This also means that the people who were able to identify all these planetary locations, they knew what they were doing. Even if you're not, even if you don't want to believe all the catastrophes that our ancestors talk about, you still have to admit that the people who did these zodiacs, they were on top of it. They were not dumb monkeys. These people knew what they were doing, right? They had access to physics. They knew what they were doing cosmologically. They had their astronomy going. You have, to be able to do all of these calculations, to do all of these kinds of recording, you have to be on top of it. You cannot be a monkey. It's just not going to happen. What's even more interesting is that these dates that we are getting from these zodiacs, that means that the Egyptians, whoever the Egyptians were that were doing hieroglyphics, they existed concurrently with, medieval Europe and stuff like that, right? These are not ancient situations. Whatever was going on in Egypt during 1000 plus AD, it's completely different than whatever mainstream history is teaching. And this, of course, is true because if we start to look at all the records that are used by mainstream to create the Egyptian chronology, a lot of those records are all from books that came out of the Renaissance. And as we now know, a lot, if not maybe, 99% of them, a lot of those books are all either lies, half-truths, forgeries, etc. Yeah, it's funny nowadays because that whole period of time between 0 AD to 1000 AD, right now there's a huge movement right now starting to state that none of those years ever existed in history. Right now, literally 0 AD to the 10th century AD, or the 11th century AD, I should say, people are starting to just say, hey, look, all of that never happened. Any of the books that state that there's a history in that period, there's no such thing. That it just didn't exist. It's very interesting that what we're finding while we hunt around the Renaissance and we poke around there, and as we start to discredit a lot of those works, I think it's fascinating that what we are finding is that even the Egyptian writing does not start until the 11th century AD. That's fascinating. Those are some very interesting correlations. And we've covered some of this in other shows, and we have a long way to keep going. All right, I've talked enough. Anyway, you guys get the point, right? Zodiacs, they prove a date. It's scientific. There's nothing you can do about it. We have to accept these dates. And just don't take my word for it or Flamenco's word for it or anybody else. You have the power right now to also go and test all of this stuff. So right now, using this show, I have no choice but to continue on my chronological research, acknowledging the fact that whatever civilization wrote down all of those hieroglyphs, they did not live in 1000 BC or 2000 BC or whatever. All of those hieroglyphics were written within a 400-year span between the 11th century and the 15th century AD, and there's no way around it. Like, the science points in that direction. Now, I know that's hard to hear, and I know that completely changes everything in your mind if you have not really been, altering your chronological thought process. But start here, because the ramifications are huge. Another problem, I know I said I'd end it, but another thing to think about is that the king's lists and all of that stuff, that's all done in hieroglyphics, right? Mainstream Egyptology places all of those names, back in 2000 BC plus. Now, suddenly, all of those names that Egyptologists have thrown way back in time, none of those names need to be thrown back in time. It's entirely possible that all of those names were all relative to this time frame of 1000 AD to 1400 AD. That means that the King's List, the so-called King's List, has nothing to do with the BC era and is probably documenting names of people who lived during the AD time period. What's interesting is this makes much more sense relative to you. This makes a lot more sense because when you look at the decay that the hieroglyphs show relative to the structures that they're carved into, there is definitely a dichotomy right there. You know, the hieroglyphics are not as destroyed as they really should be if they're truly 3,000 plus years old. I mean, if the hieroglyphs were that old, they should not be in the condition that they are in. The reality is those hieroglyphics should be showing far more wear and tear than they really do. Another really interesting thing as well with respect to the architecture is that a lot of those hieroglyphs are not carved into the structures themselves. They are actually carved into a plaster layered on top of the megalithic structures. So that's another indication that a completely different civilization showed up and co-opted all of the ancient Egyptian structures. So, and by the way, you know, I don't have a date for the structures. I don't have anything for that. We are only focusing on the hieroglyphs here. But what that means is that there was, you know, a civilization contemporaneous with medieval and early Renaissance, you know, Europe and stuff like that. You know, these people were writing in hieroglyphs while those people up there were writing in Welsh and Latin. You know, they're all working simultaneously. Speaking of that, actually, here's another connection to those time periods. What's even more interesting is that if you look at ancient Welsh, you can actually use Welsh to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. How do you like that connection? That makes things even more insane. And if you really start looking at the real migrations of the different humans in that area, things completely change as well, and the hieroglyphs start to make even more sense. Oh, and one more thing to make note. When we look at the ancient Egyptian horoscopes and zodiacs, when we look at the signs on those zodiacs, we find the zodiacal signs like the crab and the scorpion, etc. We find all of those in supposed ancient Egyptian zodiacs. But think about it. The crab, the scorpion, etc., those things are generally considered more Eurocentric. Why is it that ancient Egyptians would have the exact same symbols that people up in Europe and beyond have? In fact, it's really weird because, you know, it gets even crazier. For whatever reason, all over this planet, the zodiacal symbols are all very similar, if not identical. This is another problem that mainstream historians have no answer for, right? If all of these hieroglyphs and zodiacs were created, you know, 3,000-4,000 years ago, why do all of these hieroglyphs match the same symbology that everybody else uses as well in supposed different time periods and at times where nobody was supposed to be talking to each other? How did that happen? All right, we'll talk about that more in a different show. Okay, now I'm for serious going to leave. All right, you guys, whatever. Okay.